Before the world saw the stunning precision of modern air wars in places like Iraq or Kosovo, there was Italy, a rugged, battered land where the idea of winning a war from the skies was first put to the test. In the spring of March 1944, over central Italy, the morning sky trembled with the hum of Allied bombers. From Naples to Anzio, squadrons of B-26 and P-47s cut through broken clouds, their engines shaking the valleys below. Freight trains burst into flame, bridges crumbled into rivers, and smoke rolled across the mountain passes. The Allies called it Operation Strangle, an audacious plan to choke the German 10th Army into collapse without a single trench advance. The concept was simple: destroy every road, bridge and railway feeding Kesselring's defences along the Gustav Line, and starvation, not artillery, would break the stalemate in Italy. General Ira Eaker, commander of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, believed the skies could do what months of ground fighting could not. Supporting him was Solly Zuckermann, a British scientist whose operational research promised mathematical victory. His models claimed that if enough rail yards and depots were bombed, the enemy's supply system would fail within weeks. This was warfare reimagined, clean, scientific and modern, a test of whether logic and machinery could replace blood and attrition. Yet beneath the roar of engines, another war was being fought, one of endurance and deception. German engineers rebuilt bridges by lantern light. Mule convoys slipped through mountain trails unseen by reconnaissance planes, and every crater filled before dawn. Allied intelligence insisted success was imminent, but the numbers lied. Supplies still moved, armies still fought, and while the bombers filled the sky with confidence, the enemy quietly turned adaptation into a matter of survival. This is the story of how air power first tried to win a war alone, a campaign born from genius and arrogance shaped by weather, mountains, and human resilience. Operation Strangle would promise to change warfare forever, but instead would expose the limits of air supremacy and teach the Allies a lesson written not in victory, but in smoke, silence, and endurance. By the end of 1943, Italy had become a proving ground for the future of warfare. The Allied armies, exhausted and bloodied, were stalled along the Gustav Line, a chain of defences carved through mountains, rivers and ruins. Weeks of attrition had shown that the terrain favoured the defender, and that every mile northward came at a terrible cost. To break the deadlock, the Allied High Command turned their hopes upward, to the sky. Air power, they believed, could succeed where infantry and armour had failed. The lessons of Sicily and North Africa had convinced planners that victory could be engineered, not just fought for. Operation Strangle was to be the grand experiment, a campaign to prove that air power alone could control the outcome of war on the ground. At its heart stood General Ira Eaker, the steady, soft-spoken commander of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. Eaker was no gambler by nature, but he carried the conviction of a man who believed the future had already arrived. To him, Italy was not just a campaign, it was a test of doctrine. His operational research team reduced the enemy's strength to equations: destroy enough bridges, rail yards and depots, and the German army's supply arteries would collapse. To the planners, it was elegant, even inevitable. The Germans would be starved of ammunition, fuel and food. The front would weaken, and Kesselring's 10th Army would be forced to withdraw from central Italy without the Allies ever launching a major assault. It would be a victory for intellect over bloodshed, for precision over chaos. But Italy was not a laboratory. It was a land of mountains, storms, and human will. Every calculation ignored the ingenuity of the enemy, the limits of the technology, and the unforgiving weather that could turn a perfect plan into smoke and silence. As the first bombers lifted off for Operation Strangle in March 1944, few realised that the experiment ahead would not prove air power's triumph, but its trial. After the fall of Sicily in August 1943, Germany's grip on southern Europe began to tremble. More than 60,000 German troops managed to escape across the Strait of Messina, bringing with them tanks, guns, and the bitter knowledge that Italy, once an ally, was no longer trustworthy. In July, Mussolini had been arrested by his own government, and Adolf Hitler saw betrayal everywhere. The Führer's paranoia deepened as Italy prepared to sign an armistice with the Allies, and in response, the German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, flooded the peninsula with troops. Northern Italy was occupied within days, and by autumn the Wehrmacht stood alone to defend the Italian front. Two of Hitler's most seasoned commanders soon clashed over strategy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, believed Italy was a trap, a narrow, mountainous corridor where divisions would bleed without gain. He argued for a withdrawal north of the Po River to form a strong line between Italy, Austria and southern Germany. But Field Marshal Albert Kesselring saw the landscape differently. To him, Italy's ridges, valleys, and limited roads offered a natural fortress. He believed he could hold the Allies for months, perhaps years, using the country's brutal terrain as his greatest ally. Hitler sided with Kesselring. Rommel was transferred to France to prepare for the expected Allied invasion of Western Europe, leaving Kesselring as supreme commander of all German forces in Italy. It was a decision that would shape the campaign's future. With characteristic discipline and optimism, Kesselring reorganised his troops into the 10th Army, a mix of hardened veterans from Stalingrad, the Eastern Front and North Africa. By November 1943, these men had turned the Italian peninsula into a labyrinth of fortified lines. The most formidable of these, stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic, was the Gustav Line. Anchored at Monte Cassino, it was a masterpiece of defence. Minefields, bunkers and artillery positions carved into mountainsides, covering every road and river crossing. For 6 months the Allies hurled men and machines against it. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud, artillery thundered day and night, and still the line held. Kesselring's strategy was working. The Allied advance had ground to a halt. The situation created a crisis not only for the armies on the ground, but for Allied planners in the air. If brute force could not break the Gustav Line, perhaps precision from the skies could. And so, in the spring of 1944, while soldiers dug in beneath the ruined abbey of Monte Cassino, the Allied Air Command prepared to wage a very different kind of battle. One that would unfold not across trenches and hills, but across the open, unforgiving sky of Italy. By the winter of 1943, the Italian campaign had slowed to exhaustion. The Allied push toward Rome had bogged down among the ridges of the Apennines and the shattered towns along the Liri Valley. The Gustav Line, anchored at Monte Cassino, had turned central Italy into a fortress. The Anzio landings, meant to bypass it, had only created a beachhead that was slowly being strangled in return. Each attack brought heavier losses and little movement. Faced with a front that refused to break, Allied planners sought a new lever of force. If the enemy could not be uprooted, perhaps he could be starved. Thus emerged a radical idea: cut off the German 10th Army's lifelines by air alone. The plan was ambitious in both scale and confidence. Hundreds of bombers and fighter bombers would strike every bridge, road and rail connection, feeding Kesselring's divisions south of Rome. The campaign was given a fitting name: Operation Strangle. The combined chiefs of staff framed its objective with clinical precision: to reduce the enemy's flow of supplies to a level that would make continued operations impossible. The task demanded coordination across every Allied air command in the theatre. Heavy bombers would hit major transport hubs, mediums would strike secondary routes, fighter bombers would scour the valleys for trucks, depots and bridges. But even before the first sortie lifted off, doubts surfaced. Field Marshal Alexander questioned whether destroying marshalling yards, the chosen focus of London's planners, would achieve real paralysis. Experience in Italy suggested otherwise. Bridges, not rail yards, were the arteries of movement in the mountains. Others warned that the weather and terrain would limit accuracy, and that the enemy's repair crews, seasoned and resourceful, might recover faster than anticipated. Still, the promise of a decisive breakthrough was too tempting to ignore. In early March 1944, as the last snows clung to the ridges above Cassino, Allied airfields from Foggia to Corsica came alive with the growl of engines. Pilots were briefed, targets circled, tonnage calculated. When the first waves roared north, they carried more than bombs. They carried a belief that the air itself could decide the fate of Italy. When Operation Strangle began in early March 1944, the skies over Italy filled with sound, not just of engines, but of conviction. From the airfields at Foggia and Cerignola, squadrons of B-26 and B-25s lifted off in tight formation, bound for the rail yards of Florence, Bologna and Arezzo. Medium bombers hammered marshalling yards, while P-47 Thunderbolts and A-36 dive bombers swept the valleys, hunting trucks and bridges. The air war unfolded like a grand equation. Targets selected by analysts, results measured in tonnage, and photographs. Yet behind the confident figures lay growing tension between theory and reality. The plan's intellectual backbone came from Solomon Zuckermann's operational research, which insisted that the enemy's railway network was its Achilles heel. Destroy enough marshalling yards and the entire transport system would collapse. It was a persuasive argument on paper, and it gave commanders an illusion of precision. But not everyone agreed. Field Marshal Harold Alexander, observing from his headquarters south of Rome, warned that such logic ignored the nature of Italian terrain. Rail yards could be repaired within hours. A single bridge, when destroyed, could block an entire valley for days. Alexander argued that the bombers were hitting the wrong targets, vast open spaces that absorbed ton after ton of explosives, while trains simply detoured through repaired lines. The disagreements deepened. In London, strategists clung to Zuckermann's data. In Italy, commanders on the ground watched convoys continue to move. Reports from reconnaissance squadrons told conflicting stories. Photographs showed devastation, yet captured documents revealed German supply levels had barely changed. Every time a yard was reduced to rubble, teams of Italian labourers and German engineers cleared the wreckage and laid new track. The more the Allies bombed, the more evidence emerged of the enemy's capacity to adapt. At the same time, the Mediterranean Allied air forces, under General Ira Eaker, faced their own logistical strain. Weather grounded entire fleets for days. Cloud cover forced crews to bomb through breaks in the mist, scattering their payloads across farmland instead of bridges. And when the skies finally cleared, German anti-aircraft batteries filled the routes north with black bursts of flak, claiming crews faster than replacement rates could keep pace. Still, Eaker pressed on. The daily situation reports spoke in numbers: 1,000 sorties, 600 tons of bombs dropped, 40 locomotives destroyed, but little was said about results. By late March, the first cracks in the plan's optimism had begun to show. Allied intelligence estimated that Kesselring's armies required over 5,000 tons of supplies daily, but captured documents later revealed the figure was closer to half that amount, a devastating miscalculation. Even worse, reconnaissance found that despite constant bombing, the Germans were still moving more than 3,000 tons of material a day through improvised routes, barges, mules, and night convoys. The air offensive had created chaos but not paralysis. Operation Strangle was proving what no commander wished to admit, that war fought by mathematics could be undone by a single act of human ingenuity. By early April 1944, the cracks in Operation Strangle's logic could no longer be ignored. Reconnaissance photos showed rows of shattered marshalling yards, smoking craters where trains once stood. Yet the German supply columns still moved. Roads teemed with convoys at night, and barges slipped along Italy's western coast under camouflage nets. From the skies, the Allies could see destruction everywhere but starvation nowhere. General Ira Eaker, once the campaign's most confident believer, began to question the very science that had promised quick victory. Reports from his forward observers were blunt. Rail yards were easy to repair, and bombs rarely hit bridges from high altitude. It was time to change tactics. The focus shifted southward, from the massive open targets of the Po Valley to the narrow lifelines that wound through the mountains. The new objective was not paralysis through shock, but exhaustion through persistence. Destroy the bridges faster than they could be rebuilt. Fighter bombers would lead the effort. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a rugged, heavily armed aircraft with a massive radial engine, became the workhorse of the new phase. It could dive steeply through flak, absorb punishment, and deliver its payload with far greater accuracy than the medium bombers. Unlike the lumbering B-26s that relied on altitude and clear skies, the P-47s could fly low, strike hard, and return quickly, often making multiple runs in a single mission. New tactics evolved almost overnight. Pilots were instructed to approach along river valleys, release their 1,000-pound bombs directly at bridge abutments, and pull out just above the treetops. It was dangerous, exhausting work. Anti-aircraft fire was constant, and flak bursts often exploded so close that pilots felt the shock waves through their control sticks. Losses mounted, but so did results. The average number of sorties needed to destroy a bridge fell from more than 30 to fewer than 20. The sight of collapsed crossings and twisted spans now filled reconnaissance photographs. Yet even this success carried frustration. Italian terrain favoured the defender. Every destroyed bridge had a hidden detour. German engineers learned to improvise with astonishing speed. They built night operational bridges, temporary wooden spans that appeared broken by day and were repaired under darkness. Some were dismantled each dawn to fool Allied reconnaissance. Others were built just downstream from bombed sites, invisible beneath camouflage nets. For every bridge destroyed, another seemed to rise before the next sortie. Despite these setbacks, the fighter-bomber offensive had changed the tempo of war in Italy. The skies south of Rome became a constant battleground of movement and counter-movement. Allied pilots no longer sought to end the German war machine with a single blow. They sought instead to bleed it slowly. One bridge, one convoy, one truck at a time. The airfields of southern Italy buzzed with round-the-clock operations. Ground crews worked by torchlight to reload and refuel. Intelligence officers plotted new targets before the smoke from the last attack had even cleared. It was a battle of endurance now, not of theories and predictions, but of relentless attrition. By mid-April 1944, Operation Strangle had become both a triumph of effort and a puzzle of outcome. Allied airfields in southern Italy roared from dawn to dusk, their runways blackened with rubber from thousands of takeoffs. Bombers and fighter-bombers struck deep into the valleys north of Rome. Rail lines were shattered, bridges crumbled, and the smoke of burning convoys smeared the horizon. To the naked eye, it looked like victory. But on the ground, the results were far less certain. German forces along the Gustav Line were battered, but far from broken. Their guns still fired, their tanks still moved, and their frontline units showed no sign of starvation. The Allied intelligence summaries told two conflicting stories. The first was the official one, the optimistic bulletins filled with numbers, over 10,000 sorties flown, thousands of tons of bombs dropped, and hundreds of locomotives, trucks and bridges destroyed. To General Eaker's staff, it was proof that the campaign was working. But beneath those numbers lay a quieter set of reports. Field interrogations, intercepted signals and quartermaster records that painted a very different picture. German logistics officers estimated that Kesselring's 19 divisions required only about 2,500 tons of supplies per day, when static, not the 5,500 tons Allied analysts had assumed. Even under the constant bombardment, their convoys, horse carts and barges managed to deliver roughly 3,000 tons daily. In essence, the enemy was not being strangled. He was adapting. The Germans had learned to fight the campaign on their own terms. By day, roads lay empty, cratered and silent. By night, movement resumed. Convoys crept along riverbeds or under tree canopies, headlights dimmed to slits. Engineers diverted rail lines through tunnels or improvised ferries across rivers. In some sectors, supplies were hauled by mule over mountain passes completely invisible to Allied reconnaissance. Every bridge destroyed seemed to reappear, rebuilt, or bypassed within days. Kesselring's army, hardened by years of fighting on the Eastern Front, treated scarcity as routine. Inside the Mediterranean Allied air forces, frustration grew. The mathematics that had promised collapse now seemed hollow. The reports from the field could not be ignored. The bombers were winning battles on paper but not in reality. Even so, the offensive pressed on. No one wanted to admit that the grand experiment might be failing. The air crews continued their daily assaults, chasing trains that no longer ran, and dropping bombs on bridges that would be rebuilt by dawn. By late April, it was clear that Operation Strangle was not achieving its central aim, the paralysis of the German supply network. Yet it was not without consequence. The Germans had to divert immense manpower to repairs, travel only under the cover of night, and operate in a state of constant disruption. Roads were cratered, fuel trucks were lost, and communications were strained. Though the Wehrmacht had not been starved, it was being worn down, forced to live and fight under unending pressure from the sky. For the Allies, this distinction mattered little in the moment. What they saw was not the absence of collapse, but the promise of momentum. Strangle might not have broken Kesselring's army, but it had frayed its edges. And as the spring offensive, Operation Diadem, drew near, commanders hoped that even an imperfect strangulation might finally loosen the German grip on Italy. By May 1944, the Italian front had reached a critical point. The Allied armies, worn down by months of attrition, prepared for one final massive push to break the Gustav Line. The operation was codenamed Diadem. a coordinated assault involving the British 8th Army on the Adriatic flank and the American 5th Army pushing through the Liri Valley toward Rome. In the days leading up to the offensive, the skies above central Italy were rarely silent. The airfields of southern Italy thundered with a rhythm of urgency. Operation Strangle was still in motion, its bombers and fighter bombers continuing to hammer bridges and supply lines in what many hoped would be the final tightening of the noose around Kesselring's army. When the ground offensive began on the night of May 11, 1944, the air and artillery bombardment merged into one continuous roar. Over 1,000 Allied aircraft darkened the dawn, dropping explosives across river crossings, rail spurs and retreat routes north of Cassino. To the soldiers advancing through the smoke, it seemed that the enemy must surely have been broken, yet what awaited them was a testament to German resilience. Despite the ceaseless bombing, Kesselring's defences held with a discipline that stunned Allied commanders. Ammunition dumps had been dispersed, fuel had been cached in mountain tunnels, and reserve units manoeuvred under cover of night. Strangle had not destroyed the German army, it had only wounded it. Still, the relentless air campaign had left its mark. The destruction of bridges and roads made lateral movement nearly impossible. Kesselring's divisions could no longer shift reserves quickly between fronts. Allied deception operations suggesting an amphibious landing north of Rome forced him to spread his forces thin. When Operation Diadem struck in full force, that loss of flexibility proved fatal. The combined pressure from the British, American and French units finally ruptured the Gustav Line. German positions at Monte Cassino crumbled after months of siege. The survivors fell back in disorder toward the Sena Line and then north toward Rome. What followed was a chaotic retreat across a landscape already scarred by months of bombing. Bridges lay in ruins, convoys jammed the roads, and columns of vehicles burned where P-47s swept overhead. For the first time, air power and ground assault seemed to move in harmony. The 12th Air Force hunted retreating units from sunrise to sunset, turning each withdrawal into a gauntlet of destruction. Kesselring's once formidable 10th Army disintegrated under the combined weight of artillery, armour and air attack. From Cassino to Rome, the German forces lost an estimated 70,000 men, nearly a third of their strength in Italy. On June 4, 1944, Allied troops entered Rome, greeted by weary civilians and the distant echo of departing bombers. The city's liberation was celebrated as a victory for courage and endurance, but beneath the triumph lay questions that lingered in every operations tent. Had Operation Strangle truly paved the way for Diadem's success, or had the breakthrough come despite it? The answer, even among the men who fought it, was never clear. For some, the campaign had validated the promise of air power, isolating and exhausting the enemy before the final assault. For others, it had exposed the limits of theory and the illusion of control. What was undeniable was the cost. Italy's valleys were littered with the wreckage of bombers, the ruins of villages, and the graves of those caught between two doctrines, one of iron and one of air. As the Allies advanced toward the next defensive line in northern Italy, the lessons of Operation Strangle remained unresolved. Whether air power could ever win a war alone, or whether in the end victory still had to be claimed on the ground. The victory at Rome gave the Allies their long-awaited breakthrough, but in the intelligence rooms behind the front there was little celebration. As reports from captured German units arrived, a more sobering picture began to emerge. The enemy's retreat had not been caused by starvation or collapse, as Operation Strangle's planners had predicted. In fact, quartermaster logs recovered from Kesselring's headquarters revealed that his forces had maintained, and even increased, their stockpiles during the height of the air campaign. German supply dumps south of Rome held over 18,000 tons of material by the time of the Allied assault, compared to 17,000 when the bombing began. The harsh truth was undeniable. The so-called strangulation of the German army had never occurred. In London and Washington, the analysts who had championed the strategy of mathematical warfare faced uncomfortable questions. The operational research models created by Solly Zuckermann and his team had assumed that the destruction of marshalling yards would cripple supply traffic by up to 90%. But those assumptions rested on incomplete data. The analysts had overestimated the German army's daily consumption and underestimated its adaptability. Italian rail yards, though frequently hit, were quickly restored with local labour and spare track. More critically, Allied intelligence had failed to recognise the redundancy built into the German system. Trains no longer relied on complex sorting yards. Instead, they ran one-way routes directly from Austria and Bavaria to the front, bypassing the very bottlenecks the Allies were targeting. The Committee on Operational Analysis in Washington had made a similar mistake earlier in the war, misjudging the impact of raids on German ball-bearing factories and synthetic fuel plants. In Italy, the same flaw resurfaced, an unshakable faith in data that ignored the human factor. The Germans did not behave like the equations predicted. They repaired faster, rerouted supplies creatively, and compensated for losses through improvisation. Their logistics network became decentralized, dispersed, and far more resilient than the Allies' aerial photos suggested. For General Eaker's staff, these revelations were deeply unsettling. The Mediterranean Allied air forces had recorded success in measurable terms. Thousands of sorties, tens of thousands of tons of bombs dropped, and hundreds of locomotives destroyed, yet the results on the battlefield were ambiguous at best. In post-campaign evaluations, the Air Force's own analysts admitted that Strangle had not achieved its stated objective of rendering the German army immobile. What it had accomplished instead was the slow erosion of efficiency, a campaign of harassment that forced the enemy to fight harder for every ton of supply. It was a victory by inconvenience, not annihilation. Field Marshal Alexander later summarized it bluntly. "We did not strangle the German army. We merely made it breathe a little harder." His remark captured the campaign's essence. Intelligence had promised scientific precision. What emerged instead was a lesson in the limits of prediction. Even with overwhelming air superiority, the Allies could not fully dictate the tempo of war. They could disrupt, delay, and harass, but not destroy the enemy's will or ingenuity. For the officers studying the operation afterward, Strangle became a cautionary tale. It revealed that intelligence, no matter how advanced, could not replace understanding. War was still fought by people, by engineers repairing bridges in the dark, by pilots diving through flak, by commanders making decisions in chaos. The failure of intelligence in Italy was not one of incompetence, but of confidence. The belief that numbers could measure resilience, and that charts could predict human will. As the war in Italy pressed northward, the airmen who had flown Operation Strangle began to confront two enemies that had haunted them since the first sortie: technology and weather. On paper, the Mediterranean Allied air forces possessed the most advanced aerial tools of the war. American bombers carried the Norden bomb sight, a secret device hailed as capable of putting a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The press had celebrated it as a marvel of engineering, a symbol of American precision. In practice, however, the reality was far less perfect. The mountains of Italy were not the clear skies of test ranges. Winds over the Apennines shifted unpredictably. Cloud cover hung thick over valleys. Visibility changed by the minute. Bombardiers often had only seconds to glimpse a target before releasing their payload through mist or smoke. Even under ideal conditions, only a fraction of bombs landed within several hundred feet of their aim point. Fighter bombers faced their own technological limits. The rugged P-47 Thunderbolt, now central to the bridge-busting campaign, carried heavy ordnance and could withstand punishing ground fire. But hitting a narrow bridge span required not only skill but physics that no gun sight could perfectly solve. Dive bombing demanded that the pilot judge his speed, altitude and wind drift, while pulling out of the dive at the edge of blackout. Even the best pilots rarely achieved more than a few direct hits per mission. Accuracy depended on human reflexes, and often luck. Then there was the weather. During the critical months of March through May 1944, nearly half of all planned sorties were cancelled or rendered ineffective by conditions that no planner could control. Rain swept across the Italian peninsula for weeks, grounding squadrons in muddy airfields. When the skies cleared, haze and turbulence made high-altitude bombing unpredictable. In the spring, low-lying fog often obscured valleys until late morning, forcing bombers to attack late in the day when shadows distorted their targeting optics. Fighter bombers fared little better. Low clouds made dive runs dangerous, and sudden crosswinds pushed bombs far off course. The Germans, by contrast, turned the weather into an ally. They moved their convoys during storms, repaired tracks under the cover of rain, and used overcast skies as natural camouflage. When Allied reconnaissance planes finally passed overhead, the damage appeared greater than it was. broken tracks that had already been rerouted, destroyed bridges replaced with hidden spans, and roads cleared during the previous night. The illusion of progress became one of Operation Strangle's cruelest tricks. Eaker's after-action reports tried to account for these variables, but behind closed doors the frustration was palpable. Technology had promised precision, weather had delivered chaos. The war in Italy had exposed the gap between invention and execution, between the clean lines of engineering blueprints and the messy reality of combat. Even the Norden bomb site, treated like sacred equipment, proved powerless against clouds and wind. The data-driven approach that had underpinned Strangle could not predict the unpredictable. And yet, for all its shortcomings, the air campaign still achieved something remarkable. It forced every German truck, train and horse-drawn cart to operate in fear of the sky. Bridges could be rebuilt, but time lost could never be regained. Each cancelled sortie was a reminder that even the most modern machines of war were still subject to the oldest forces on Earth: weather, luck, and the limits of human vision. When the guns fell silent over central Italy, Operation Strangle did not end with a clear verdict. It lived on in arguments, reports, and carefully worded memoranda that stretched long after the campaign itself. For every commander who called it a failure, another insisted it had paved the way for victory. The truth, as in most wars, lay somewhere between. In the official US Army Air Force's history, the campaign was hailed as a decisive demonstration of air power's ability to isolate the battlefield. Charts and tables recorded the destruction of thousands of railcars, bridges and trucks, evidence, they claimed, that Strangle had achieved its goal. Yet on the ground, the men who had faced the German 10th Army remembered it differently. They saw an enemy that had retreated only when pressed by infantry, not one starved into submission. General Ira Eaker, proud yet candid, praised his air crews for their endurance, but privately admitted that the campaign had not fulfilled its promise. Strangle, he wrote later, showed what air power could do and what it could not. To him, the operation's greatest achievement was psychological. It proved that continuous air attack could deny an enemy freedom of movement and force him to fight under constant pressure. That was not the decisive paralysis envisioned by planners, but it was a shift in how wars would be fought, less by destruction of armies, more by exhaustion of their means to fight. Field Marshal Harold Alexander remained unconvinced. His post-war assessments described Strangle as a magnificent effort poorly aimed. He believed the focus on marshalling yards had been a strategic blunder, a triumph of theory over terrain. To Alexander, the campaign's results were masked by coincidence. Its conclusion aligned neatly with the launch of Operation Diadem, allowing its advocates to claim credit for a victory that ground forces had earned. His British reports were echoed by many American officers who had served under Mark Clark, whose Fifth Army had borne the cost of breaking the Gustav Line. They viewed Strangle not as the cause of success, but as the backdrop to it. From the German perspective, the debate took a different shape. In post-war interrogations, Luftwaffe General Erich Ritter von Pohl and several of Kesselring's staff officers acknowledged the severity of the air threat. They described convoys forced to move only at night, railways cut so often that timetables became meaningless, and supply trucks lost faster than they could be replaced. But even these admissions came with qualifications. The German army in Italy, they noted, never starved. It fought, retreated, and regrouped until the very end. Kesselring himself, reviewing the campaign in captivity, called the Allied air effort a great inconvenience, not a great defeat. The politics of memory hardened these contradictions. Air power advocates, eager to secure post-war funding and independence for their service, highlighted Operation Strangle as proof of concept, the idea that the sky could shape wars without the trenches. Critics in the army countered that air campaigns alone could never win battles, only assist them. Between them lay the unspoken truth that Italy had been a testing ground for doctrines still in infancy. Decades later, historians would revisit Strangle with fresh eyes. Some judged it a necessary experiment, an imperfect but essential step toward understanding modern warfare. Others saw in it the hubris of technology, the belief that data could substitute for human judgment. What remains clear is that Operation Strangle was not merely a campaign, but a turning point. A moment when the promise of precision met the limits of reality, and the dream of total control from the air first began to unravel. The summer of 1944 brought a new chapter to Italy's long and bitter campaign. With Rome liberated and Kesselring retreating north, Allied commanders sought to replicate the perceived success of Operation Strangle on a grander scale. The new plan was codenamed Operation Mallory Major, an ambitious follow-up designed to prevent the German Army Group C from regrouping along the Po River. This time, the mission was clear: destroy every bridge, ferry and crossing over northern Italy's most vital waterway, cutting the retreating enemy off from supply and escape. If Strangle had aimed to suffocate, Mallory Major sought to amputate. By August 1944, the Mediterranean skies once again filled with the deep roar of P-47s and B-25s. The lessons of Strangle had not been forgotten. Gone were the grand attacks on rail yards and depots. The new focus was surgical: bridges, crossings and choke points. Fighter bombers prowled the Po Valley in endless sweeps, striking at every river span between Verona and Ferrara. Heavy bombers hit the larger crossings, while medium bombers targeted road junctions and ferry terminals. From above, it looked like a masterpiece of coordination. Bridges shattered, barges overturned, entire sections of the Po choked with wreckage. For a brief time, it seemed to work. German supply traffic north of the river was thrown into chaos. Communication lines broke down, and the retreat slowed to a crawl. Even Kesselring's seasoned engineers struggled to keep up. Convoys backed up for miles, their vehicles exposed to the unending daylight attacks of Allied aircraft. For 2 weeks, the German army appeared trapped, isolated on the wrong side of the river, battered from the air, unable to move or resupply. Allied intelligence hailed the campaign as the final blow that would break German resistance in Italy once and for all. But then came the same familiar pattern: delay, miscoordination, and lost opportunity. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army, slowed by logistical difficulties and troop withdrawals for the southern France landings, could not advance fast enough to exploit the air successes. Once again, the rhythm of air power and ground movement fell out of sync. When the bombing paused to prepare for the next phase, the Germans seized their moment. Under the cover of darkness and fog, Kesselring's engineers began laying pontoon bridges, constructing makeshift ferries, and even dragging supply lines across the riverbed itself. Fuel and ammunition once again flowed to the north. Within weeks, traffic resumed, and the shattered bridges were replaced by crude but functional crossings. By the time Allied forces were ready to renew their pursuit, the window had closed. Kesselring's troops had withdrawn in relatively good order to the Gothic Line, a new series of fortifications stretching from Pisa to Rimini. Once more, the Germans had turned improvisation into survival. Post-campaign analysis revealed that despite the destruction of dozens of bridges, Operation Mallory Major had achieved only temporary disruption. The official Allied report described its results in measured tones. Despite its width, the Po River failed to halt the flow of supplies after its bridges had been destroyed. The lesson was demonstrated anew that multiple barriers are necessary to effectively undo the enemy's logistics. From the German perspective, however, the campaign's impact was devastating. General Fridolin von Zenger und Etterlin, commander of 13th and Panzer Corps, later wrote that the bombings of the Po River crossings finished the Germans in Italy. His account captured a truth that statistics could not. While the Wehrmacht had survived, it had done so in exhaustion. Units crossed the Po stripped of vehicles, horses and heavy equipment. The air attacks had shattered cohesion, turning the retreat into chaos. North of the Po, Zenger admitted, we were no longer an army. Thus, Operation Mallory Major became the mirror image of Strangle. More tactically successful, yet strategically limited. It proved that air power could cripple an army's movement, but only if ground forces were poised to exploit the weakness. Without that follow-through, even the most effective air campaign could achieve only disruption, not destruction. The skies could open the door, but men still had to walk through it. In the years that followed, Operation Strangle became more than a campaign. It became a lesson written into every manual on modern air warfare. What began as a bold experiment in Italy's narrow valleys evolved into a case study in the limits of strategy, technology, and human understanding. To many air power theorists, Strangle marked the first real attempt to use aircraft not merely to support armies, but to replace them, to win by isolation rather than by confrontation. Yet its results, both celebrated and contested, revealed that even the most powerful air fleets could not fully command the chaos of war. The first lesson was one of coordination. Air interdiction could shape the battlefield, but it could not win it alone. Without the synchronized pressure of ground offensives, the enemy always found room to recover. The Germans, forced into constant repair and improvisation, had suffered greatly under the weight of Allied bombing. Yet, as the results showed, harassment was not the same as paralysis. The campaigns of Strangle and Mallory Major proved that air dominance required constant cooperation with ground manoeuvre if it was to produce decisive outcomes. The second lesson lay in intelligence and expectation. The planners who trusted in mathematics and aerial photography had overestimated the precision of their data. They learned that the battlefield was not an equation. It was a living system. Targets rebuilt, railways rerouted, soldiers adapted. Operational research gave commanders confidence, but not certainty. The campaign exposed the danger of believing that war could be predicted through numbers alone. In Italy, the equations had all been correct, but the assumptions were wrong. The third lesson was technological. The machines that symbolised Allied progress, the Norden bombsight, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the B-26 Marauder, had shown extraordinary capability, but not invincibility. Weather, geography, and human error remained the constant variables that no design could eliminate. For every bridge destroyed, another mission failed because of fog, wind, or misjudged aim. The campaign taught future generations that precision was a pursuit, not a promise. And finally, Strangle left a moral lesson, one quietly reflected upon by the men who flew its missions. The pilots and bombardiers had done their duty with courage, often under lethal flak and uncertain skies. They witnessed towns burning, convoys exploding, and valleys consumed by smoke, yet the front lines below scarcely moved. In their diaries and post-war interviews, many spoke of frustration, of effort without clear reward. They came to understand that victory in the air did not always mean victory on the ground. In retrospect, historians came to view Operation Strangle not as a failure, but as a necessary step in the evolution of air doctrine. It bridged the gap between the early theories of air supremacy and the more complex joint operations that would define later conflicts. Its lessons echoed decades later in the jungles of Vietnam and the deserts of Iraq, where air campaigns once again sought to sever an enemy's lifelines from above. Italy's skies, though filled with the optimism of science and the roar of engines, had delivered a humbling truth, that no matter how high men flew, the outcome of war would always be decided where earth and courage meet. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the lessons of Italy lingered in the minds of generals, scientists and airmen alike. Operation Strangle was never the decisive victory it was meant to be, but it became a milestone in understanding the reach and the limits of air power. From the valleys of Cassino to the bridges over the Po, it revealed both the brilliance of Allied ambition and the stubborn resilience of the human spirit beneath bombardment. The campaign had promised precision, control, and the end of attritional war. What it delivered was something far more enduring: knowledge. It showed that no matter how advanced the machinery or the mathematics, war remained a contest of will, endurance, and adaptation. The ruins left behind told their own story. Across Italy, the skeletal remains of bridges and rail lines still bore the scars of the campaign. Villages once caught between bombers and convoys stood as silent witnesses to a war that had turned science into spectacle. Pilots who had flown through storms of flak remembered the sound of their engines more vividly than any medal. Civilians remembered the nights when the mountains themselves seemed to burn. For those who lived it, Operation Strangle was not just an experiment, it was survival measured in minutes of daylight and moments of silence. In the decades that followed, military historians would revisit the campaign with the detachment of analysts and the reverence of students. They recognized it as the beginning of a doctrine that would define the second half of the 20th century, the belief that dominance of the air could dictate the course of battle. Yet the Italy campaign also carried its quiet warning, that even total air superiority could not replace the resolve of soldiers on the ground or the unpredictability of human ingenuity. Today, the story of Operation Strangle endures not because it was a victory, but because it was a revelation. It stands as a reminder that progress in war often comes through failure, that each misjudged sortie, each bridge rebuilt, each lesson learned in fire and smoke brought the world closer to understanding how to wage war and how to survive it. The skies over Italy, once filled with noise, now rest in peace. But the echoes of that experiment in power, persistence, and belief still whisper through history. that control from above is never absolute, and that even in an age of machines, the outcome of war is still shaped by the hearts and endurance of those below.